The CEO fired him for being 11 minutes late. By midnight, she would be stranded alone on a dark stretch of highway, praying for help from anyone at all. The only person who stopped would be the man she had just humiliated. The elevators opened onto the executive floor of Montgomery Freight at exactly 8:11 a.m. Employees glanced toward the reception area as Ethan Walker hurried through the glass doors, slightly out of breath, his damp jacket hanging over one arm. His dark pickup had barely cooled in the parking lot. A few coworkers exchanged nervous looks. Ethan was never late. Not once in 3 years. Not through snowstorms. Not through power outages. Not even when half the city had shut down after a severe thunderstorm the previous spring. Yet here he was, 11 minutes behind schedule. He adjusted the strap of his worn messenger bag and walked toward the time clock. "Ethan," a voice called sharply. He stopped. The entire lobby seemed to freeze. Claire Montgomery stood near the reception desk. Her charcoal business suit was flawless. Her posture was straight and composed. The young CEO had built a reputation for demanding excellence and tolerating absolutely no excuses. "My office." Now, her words were calm, but the tension behind them was unmistakable. Ethan nodded quietly. "Yes, ma'am." Several employees lowered their eyes as he followed her toward the executive conference room. The glass walls offered little privacy. People pretended to work while secretly watching. Claire closed the door behind them. Sunlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Columbus. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Claire opened a personnel file resting on the table. 11 minutes late. Ethan inhaled slowly. "I know. Do you?" Her tone hardened. "Because every employee in this company understands the standard." Ethan remained calm. "There was an emergency this morning." Claire folded her arms. "An emergency? My daughter, everyone has reasons." Her interruption landed like a gavel. Ethan fell silent. Claire continued. "Leadership starts with accountability. If I make exceptions for one person, I make exceptions for everyone." Outside the conference room, employees shifted uncomfortably behind their computer screens. The office seemed quieter than usual. The hum of printers and keyboards faded beneath the weight of the conversation unfolding behind glass. Ethan looked down briefly before meeting her eyes again. "I've given this company everything I have. And today you failed to meet expectations." The words came without hesitation, without anger. Somehow that made them colder. Ethan stood still. Not defensive, not pleading, just tired. Claire slid a document across the table. "Effective immediately, your employment is terminated." The room fell silent. Even through the glass walls, people understood what had just happened. Ethan stared at the paper. 3 years of loyalty reduced to a single sheet. He could have argued. He could have explained that he had spent most of the night sitting beside a hospital bed. He could have told her about Sophie's sudden respiratory complications and the frightening hours waiting for doctors to clear her to go home. He could have shown her the hospital bracelet still tucked into his jacket pocket. But he didn't. Instead, he nodded once. Understood. Claire seemed almost surprised by the lack of resistance. "That's all." Ethan offered a faint, weary smile. "You've already made your decision." For a brief second, something flickered in her expression. Then it disappeared. "Security will escort you out." Ethan picked up the termination notice and turned toward the door. Every eye in the office followed him as he stepped into the hallway. No one spoke. No one knew what to say. He gathered the few personal items from his workstation. A framed photograph of Sophie smiling beside a pumpkin patch, a faded coffee mug, and a small notebook filled with maintenance schedules. That was all. As he headed toward the elevators, one coworker whispered, "I'm sorry, Ethan." He smiled gently. "Take care of yourself." Then the elevator doors closed. The office slowly returned to life. Phones rang. Emails arrived. Meetings continued. Yet an uncomfortable silence lingered beneath it all, like a storm cloud refusing to move on. Upstairs, Claire stood alone beside her window. She watched Ethan's old pickup leave the parking lot and disappear into morning traffic. In her mind, she had done the right thing. She had protected company standards. She had reinforced accountability. She had made the hard decision leaders were supposed to make. What she didn't know was that the man she had just fired wasn't rushing home to complain or seek revenge. He was driving toward a small apartment across town where a 9-year-old girl sat waiting by the window, wondering if her daddy had made it to work after spending the night beside her hospital bed. The drive home felt longer than usual. Afternoon sunlight stretched across the windshield of Ethan Walker's aging pickup as traffic crawled through downtown Columbus. He kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting near the folded termination notice sitting silently on the passenger seat. The paper looked heavier than it should have. He glanced at it once, then looked away. Some things gained weight when attached to responsibility. By the time he turned into the apartment complex, the sky had softened into pale shades of gold and blue. The building was nothing special. 3 stories, faded brick, small balconies lined with flower pots and bicycles. But it was home. Ethan parked and sat for a moment before stepping out. He wanted to leave the disappointment outside. Sophie deserved better than that. As he climbed the stairs, he heard the familiar sound of footsteps racing toward the door. Before he could even reach for his keys, the door swung open. "Daddy!" Sophie launched herself into his arms with the enthusiasm only a child could manage after a difficult day. Ethan smiled immediately, not because life was easy, because she was there. "Hey, kiddo." Sophie wrapped her arms around his neck. "I waited by the window. I noticed. Did you have a good day?" The question landed gently. Ethan felt his chest tighten for half a second. Then he smiled again. "I got to come home early." Sophie seemed satisfied with that answer. Children often sensed more than adults realized, but they also trusted the people they loved. Inside the apartment, the scent of tomato soup drifted from the kitchen. The small space felt warm despite its modest size. Family photos covered one wall. School drawings decorated the refrigerator. Nothing expensive, everything meaningful. Sophie climbed onto a chair at the kitchen table while Ethan prepared dinner. She watched him carefully. "Daddy." "Yeah." "Are you mad at me?" Ethan turned immediately. "What?" "Because of the hospital." The words came quietly. "If I did not get sick, you would not have had to stay up all night." Ethan set down the spoon and crossed the room. He knelt beside her chair. "Look at me." Sophie raised her eyes. "None of this is your fault. But you look tired this morning." Ethan smiled softly. "Sweetheart, parents get tired. That is part of the job." "Really?" "Absolutely. Even superheroes?" Ethan laughed. "Especially superheroes." That finally earned a grin. The tension faded from her small shoulders. Ethan brushed a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "You were the best thing that ever happened to me, Sophie. Never forget that." She nodded. "Okay." Dinner passed quietly. They talked about school projects, favorite books, and the stray orange cat that kept appearing near the mailbox downstairs. For a little while, life felt normal. Afterward, Sophie settled on the couch with a blanket while Ethan washed dishes. The evening sunlight faded beyond the apartment windows. Shadows stretched across the living room floor. Somewhere outside, a lawn mower hummed in the distance. Everything felt ordinary. Yet beneath that calm, uncertainty waited. Later that night, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table. The apartment was silent except for the soft ticking of the wall clock. He unfolded the termination notice and read it again. Not because he needed to, because reality sometimes required repetition before it felt real. He studied the numbers in his checking account. Rent, utilities, groceries, medical bills. The calculations were familiar. The margin for error was not. He leaned back in his chair and stared toward the framed photograph hanging above the television. It showed him, Sophie, and his late wife Emily standing beneath autumn leaves almost 10 years earlier. Emily's smile seemed frozen in time. Ethan looked at the picture for a long moment. "I am trying," he whispered. The room offered no answer. But somehow the silence felt less lonely than before. In the bedroom, Sophie stirred briefly in her sleep and murmured something unintelligible before settling again. Ethan smiled despite everything. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges tomorrow brought, he would face them the same way he always had. One step at a time, quietly, with dignity. Because some people measured success by titles, corner offices, and quarterly reports. Ethan Walker measured it by a little girl sleeping safely down the hall. And for now, that was enough. The next morning began before sunrise for Claire Montgomery. The city skyline glowed faintly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse as she stood reviewing reports on a tablet while coffee cooled beside her untouched. Efficiency had always been her comfort zone. Numbers made sense. Deadlines made sense. Results made sense. People were harder. By 7 o'clock, she was already in the back seat of a company sedan heading toward headquarters. Messages flooded her phone. Investors wanted updates. Executives wanted approvals. Clients wanted answers. It was exactly the kind of pressure she had spent years learning to navigate. At Montgomery Freight, the day unfolded at full speed. Meetings stacked on meetings. Forecasts. Contracts. Presentations. Every minute seemed scheduled before it happened. Shortly after noon, Claire entered the boardroom for the most important negotiation of the quarter. 12 executives sat around a polished walnut table. Screens displayed charts, shipping routes, and revenue projections. For nearly 3 hours, the discussion continued. Questions came rapidly. Decisions came faster. Claire remained composed through all of it. Focused. Precise. Unshakable. Finally, just after 3 in the afternoon, the last signature appeared on the agreement. The room erupted into applause. One of the directors smiled broadly. Congratulations, Claire. This is the largest contract we have secured in 5 years. Another executive raised a bottle of sparkling water. To Montgomery Freight. Glasses lifted around the room. Claire allowed herself a small smile. Thank you, everyone. On the surface, it should have felt like victory. Yet as people congratulated her and discussed celebrations, her attention drifted toward the empty chair near the far wall. For reasons she could not explain, she suddenly remembered the quiet expression on Ethan Walker's face when he had accepted his termination without argument. No anger, no excuses, no resentment, just dignity. The memory lingered longer than she expected. By early evening, the office began to empty. Lights switched off one floor at a time. The sounds of conversation faded into silence. Claire remained behind, reviewing final documents before heading home. Outside, dark clouds gathered across the Ohio sky. A weather alert flashed briefly across her phone. Heavy rain expected overnight. She barely noticed. Around 8:30, she finally left the building. The parking garage echoed softly beneath her heels. Her black luxury sedan waited near the elevator. Within minutes, she was driving north toward a leadership retreat center where she planned to spend the night before a conference the following morning. Rain began as a light mist. Then it grew heavier. Streetlights blurred against the windshield. Wipers moved steadily back and forth. Traffic thinned as the city disappeared behind her. Mile after mile, the highway stretched through darkness. Claire lowered the radio volume and focused on the road ahead. For the first time all day, silence surrounded her. Then her phone rang. Claire speaking. The investors loved the announcement, her assistant said. Everyone is thrilled. Good. You should be proud. Claire glanced through the rain. Maybe. The assistant laughed softly. That does not sound like a woman celebrating. Claire looked toward the dark highway beyond her headlights. I will call you tomorrow. She ended the conversation and placed the phone on the passenger seat. A few minutes later, the engine made a sound she had never heard before. A subtle hesitation. Then another. Claire frowned. The dashboard illuminated with a warning light. No, the vehicle jerked slightly. Rain hammered against the roof. The warning light flashed again. Another mile passed. Then the engine lost power completely. Claire tightened her grip on the steering wheel. The sedan slowed rapidly. She guided it toward the shoulder as momentum carried the vehicle forward. Finally, it rolled to a stop beside an empty stretch of road. Silence filled the cabin except for the relentless drumming of rain. Claire pressed the ignition button once. Nothing. Again. Nothing. The dashboard flickered weakly before going dark. She stared through the windshield. No buildings. No gas stations. No houses. Only miles of wet highway disappearing into darkness. Then she looked at her phone. 1 bar of signal. It vanished a second later. For the first time in a very long time, Claire Montgomery found herself completely alone, with no assistant, no boardroom, no resources, and no immediate solution. Claire stared through the rain-streaked windshield as darkness settled over the empty highway. She tried the ignition again. Nothing. She checked her phone once more. No signal. The tiny icon at the top of the screen disappeared completely. For the first time in years, there was no assistant to call, no executive team to rely on, no immediate solution waiting at the touch of a button. Just rain. Endless rain. The storm rolled across the countryside in heavy sheets, rattling against the windows of the disabled sedan. Headlights occasionally appeared in the distance, growing brighter as vehicles approached. Claire lifted her hand hopefully each time. None of them stopped. One by one they sped past, disappearing into the darkness ahead. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. The heater had long since stopped working. The air inside the car grew cooler. Claire wrapped her arms around herself and looked through the windshield again. The highway felt abandoned. The world beyond her headlights seemed to have vanished entirely. Then she saw a faint glow emerging through the storm. Two headlights appeared far down the road. Unlike the others, they slowed. Claire sat up straight. The approaching vehicle reduced speed even further before pulling onto the shoulder several yards ahead of her sedan. An older pickup truck. The driver's door opened. A figure stepped into the rain. Claire could not see his face at first. The man pulled his jacket tighter against the weather and walked toward her vehicle carrying a flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness. Claire lowered her window slightly. Rain immediately blew inside. "Are you okay?" the man asked. The familiar voice hit her before the light revealed his face. Claire froze. Ethan Walker stood beside her door. Water dripped from his jacket. His hair was soaked from the rain. Yet his expression remained calm. Not angry. Not bitter. Just concerned. For several seconds neither spoke. Ethan seemed surprised too, though not nearly as much as Claire. "Mr. Walker," she finally said. "Claire." He glanced toward the disabled sedan. "Looks like you are having trouble." She almost laughed at the understatement. "The car died about an hour ago." Ethan nodded. "Have you called for help?" "No signal." He checked his own phone briefly. "Same here." Rain continued drumming against metal and glass. Claire felt embarrassment creeping into her voice. "You do not have to stay." Ethan looked at her as if the suggestion made no sense. "You are stranded on the side of the road in a storm." Another pause followed. "Of course I am staying." Claire lowered her eyes for a moment. Earlier that morning, she had taken away his job. Now he was the only person who had stopped. The realization settled heavily inside her. Ethan walked around the vehicle with his flashlight, inspecting it carefully. After several minutes, he returned. "I think I know what happened. Can you fix it?" "Maybe." He offered a small smile. "No promises." Claire stepped out beneath the umbrella he handed her. Together, they moved toward the front of the sedan. Ethan opened the hood and studied the engine compartment. Rain bounced off the metal surfaces while the flashlight beam danced across wires and hoses. Claire watched quietly. His movements were confident and methodical. No wasted motion. No frustration. Just patience. After nearly 20 minutes, Ethan closed the hood again. "The problem is worse than I thought." Claire sighed. "That sounds expensive." "Not necessarily." He looked toward the dark highway. "But it is not getting fixed tonight." Thunder rumbled softly in the distance. Ethan checked the road again. "There is an old service station about 2 miles from here. Closed years ago, but the building is still standing. It will keep us dry until morning." Claire hesitated. The successful executive who negotiated million-dollar contracts suddenly felt very far away. She was simply a woman standing beside a broken car in the middle of nowhere. Ethan seemed to understand her uncertainty. "You do not have to trust me," he said gently. "But you should not stay out here." Claire met his eyes. There was no resentment in them. No score being settled. No lesson being taught. Only quiet decency. The kind that expected nothing in return. Something inside her shifted. Very slightly. Very quietly. "All right," she said. Ethan nodded. "Then let us get out of the rain." As they walked toward the pickup truck, Claire glanced back at the disabled sedan sitting alone on the shoulder. Just hours earlier, she had felt completely in control of her world. Now the only thing standing between her and a long night in the storm was the man she had failed to understand. The old service station sat beside a forgotten county road like a relic from another era. Its faded sign creaked softly in the wind while rain swept across the empty parking lot. Ethan parked beneath the rusted awning and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither he nor Claire moved. The storm continued drumming against the roof above them. Then Ethan opened his door. "Come on." Claire followed him through the rain toward the building. The front windows were boarded, but the side entrance still worked. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust, old wood, and motor oil that had soaked into the concrete decades earlier. A few emergency lanterns hung near a workbench. Ethan found one and switched it on. Warm yellow light pushed back the darkness. "You have been here before?" Claire asked. "A few times." Ethan set the lantern on a counter. "When storms got bad." Claire looked around. The place was simple. Worn chairs, empty shelves, an old soda machine that had not worked in years. Yet somehow it felt safer than the highway. Ethan opened a storage cabinet and removed 2 clean blankets sealed inside plastic bags. "Prepared?" Claire asked. A faint smile crossed his face. Single parents learn to prepare for everything. Claire accepted the blanket. Thank you. Ethan nodded and sat on a nearby chair. For several minutes, only the sound of rain filled the building. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was simply unfamiliar. Claire realized she had spent most of her life surrounded by noise. Meetings, calls, deadlines, expectations. Yet this quiet seemed heavier than all of them. Finally she spoke. How is your daughter? Ethan looked up. The question seemed to surprise him. Better. She was sick. He hesitated briefly. She had breathing complications yesterday. We spent most of the night at the hospital. Claire felt her stomach tighten. Yesterday? Ethan nodded. The doctors released her around 5 in the morning. The realization landed harder than she expected. The conference room. The termination notice. The 11 minutes. Claire lowered her eyes. I did not know. Ethan studied the lantern flame. No. Rain rattled against the windows. Neither spoke for several seconds. You could have told me. Ethan smiled gently. Not bitterly. Not sarcastically. Just honestly. You had already decided. Claire looked away. The words hurt because they were true. Ethan shifted slightly in his chair. How long have you been running Montgomery Freight? The change in subject caught her off guard. 7 years. That is impressive. Claire laughed softly. Most people do not use that word. What word? Impressive. Ethan shrugged. Building something that large takes discipline. Claire stared at him. You are complimenting me? Should I not? She almost smiled. After everything that happened today, most people would not. Ethan folded his hands. Holding on to anger does not solve much. The lantern flickered softly between them. Claire found herself studying him differently now. She had spent years evaluating people through performance reviews, productivity reports, and efficiency metrics. Yet none of those things explained the man sitting across from her. He had lost his job that morning. He should have been angry. Instead, he had stopped in the middle of a storm to help someone who had treated him unfairly. You are different than I expected, Claire admitted. Ethan laughed quietly. That makes 2 of us. What did you expect? Honestly, yes. Someone colder. Claire looked toward the rain-streaked windows. That is probably fair. Maybe. Ethan leaned back slightly. Or maybe people are more complicated than first impressions. The storm continued outside while the old station glowed softly beneath the lantern light. For the first time that day, Claire felt something she had not experienced in years. Not control. Not success. Not certainty. Humility. And somewhere beneath it, a growing respect for a man she had completely misjudged. Neither of them noticed that the hours were slipping by. But something important was changing in the quiet space between them. Not because of what was being said. Because of what was finally being understood. The storm began to weaken sometime after midnight. Rain no longer hammered the roof with the same intensity. Instead, it fell in a steady rhythm that blended with the distant sound of wind moving across open fields. The lantern between them cast a warm circle of light that seemed strangely disconnected from the world outside. Claire sat quietly beneath the blanket while Ethan sorted through a small toolbox he kept in the back of his truck. You always carry that with you? She asked. Ethan glanced up. The toolbox. Yes. Pretty much. He smiled faintly. Life breaks things when you least expect it. Claire laughed softly. That sounds like experience talking. It usually is. The conversation drifted naturally after that. No boardroom language. No performance reviews. No negotiations. Just 2 people passing time while waiting for the storm to pass. At one point, Claire noticed a faded photograph tucked inside Ethan's wallet when he reached for a receipt. The picture showed a younger Ethan standing beside several men wearing matching military uniforms. Sophie appeared in the corner of another photograph attached behind it. Claire pointed gently. That looks important. Ethan followed her gaze. It is. Military. He nodded. A long time ago. Claire studied the image more carefully. You never mentioned it. Ethan shrugged. Most people never ask. Something about the answer stayed with her. She realized how little she actually knew about him despite having supervised him for nearly 3 years. She knew employee numbers, attendance records, maintenance reports. Yet she had never taken time to learn the story behind the man himself. How long did you serve? She asked. Almost 12 years. Claire blinked. 12. Ethan nodded. After high school. What made you leave? For the first time, he grew quiet. The lantern reflected softly in his eyes. Emily got sick. Claire immediately understood. Your wife. Ethan nodded again. By the time Sophie was born, priorities changed. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of sacrifice. Claire leaned back slowly. You gave up your career. I chose my family. That could not have been easy. Ethan smiled. The easiest decision I ever made. Silence settled again. Not empty silence. Thoughtful silence. Claire found herself staring at the old photograph. 12 years of service. A family tragedy. A daughter with medical challenges. And through all of it, Ethan carried himself with quiet dignity instead of resentment. You know, Claire said carefully, most people would have talked about those accomplishments. Ethan looked genuinely confused. Why? Because they are impressive. He chuckled softly. Maybe, but Sophie does not care about medals. Claire smiled despite herself. No, she mostly cares whether I remember pancake Saturdays. For the first time that night, Claire laughed openly. The sound surprised even her. Ethan laughed too. The old service station suddenly felt less like a shelter and more like a place where walls were slowly coming down. A short time later, Ethan stepped outside to check the weather. Claire remained inside. Her eyes wandered around the room until they landed on the toolbox sitting partially open near the chair. She had no intention of snooping, yet something visible near the top caught her attention. A small framed certificate rested between several papers. Curious, she leaned closer. The lantern light illuminated the words. Recognition for exceptional service and leadership. Below it sat another document bearing military commendations. Claire stared for several seconds. There were more achievements than she expected. More responsibility. More distinction. Yet Ethan had never mentioned any of it. When he returned moments later, he noticed her expression. Everything okay? Claire looked up slowly. You were not just a mechanic. Ethan smiled awkwardly. Not exactly. You led people. Sometimes. You trained people. A few. Claire shook her head in disbelief. Why would you never tell anyone? Ethan set the toolbox aside. Because who I was 20 years ago is not the most important thing about me. He paused briefly. Who I am now matters more. The words settled heavily in the quiet room. Outside, the last of the storm clouds drifted across the night sky. Inside, Claire felt something shift once again. It was not admiration for achievements. It was respect for character. And she was beginning to understand that the strongest people were often the ones who never felt the need to announce their strength at all. The first gray light of morning appeared shortly after 5 o'clock. The storm had finally moved east, leaving behind a landscape washed clean by rain. Ethan stepped outside and looked toward the horizon while cool air drifted across the empty fields. When he returned, Claire was sitting quietly beside the lantern, staring at her phone. Signal, he asked. She shook her head. Still nothing. Ethan glanced through the dusty front window. There is a small town about 10 miles from here. Once the road's clear, we can get help. Claire nodded, but her attention remained fixed on the screen. Suddenly the phone vibrated. One bar of service flashed briefly, then another. Before she could react, several notifications flooded in at once. Emails, voicemails, messages. The signal vanished again, but not before a handful of alerts had downloaded. Claire opened the first message. It came from her assistant. Subject, personnel documentation. She frowned. What is it? Ethan asked. Probably work. She opened the attachment absent-mindedly. The file contained personnel reports from the previous day. One document caught her attention immediately. Ethan Walker. She hesitated. Then she opened it. At first, she only intended to review the termination paperwork. Instead, another document appeared beneath it. Medical leave verification submitted electronically at 6:14 a.m. Claire stared. Her eyes moved across the screen slowly. Pediatric Emergency Department. Overnight admission. Guardian present throughout treatment. Release time, 5:02 a.m. She felt her stomach drop. No, Ethan looked up. Something wrong. Claire barely heard him. Another attachment appeared below the first. Security footage timestamp. Parking garage entrance. She watched silently as Ethan's pickup entered company property. The timestamp matched exactly what he had told her. The hospital was nearly 40 miles from the office. He had driven directly from the emergency room. No detour. No excuse. No dishonesty. Just a father trying to reach work after a night beside his sick child. Claire lowered the phone slowly. The room seemed unusually quiet. Ethan noticed the change in her expression. Claire. She looked at him. For the first time since they met, she did not see an employee. She saw a man who had been carrying burdens she never bothered to understand. A man who had spent the night in a hospital chair. A man who had still shown up. A man she had fired before listening. I saw the records. Ethan remained silent. Everything you said was true. He offered a small nod. I never said it was not. The words were gentle. That somehow made them hurt more. Claire stood and walked toward the window. Outside, morning light spread across the wet pavement. Birds had begun to sing somewhere beyond the empty road. The world was waking up. Yet inside her, something was breaking apart. Not pride exactly. Something deeper. Certainty. For years, she had trusted her judgment without question. Fast decisions. Strong decisions. Efficient decisions. Yesterday, she had made one in less than 3 minutes. Now she realized how incomplete that judgment had been. Ethan remained seated. He did not demand an apology. He did not remind her what she had done. He simply waited. Claire turned back toward him. Why did you not tell me all of this? Ethan looked down briefly before answering. Because leadership is not tested when people treat you fairly. He paused. It is tested when they do not. The answer landed harder than any accusation could have. Claire felt her eyes sting unexpectedly. She blinked and looked away. Ethan had every reason to be angry. Instead, he offered grace. He had every reason to leave her stranded. Instead, he had stopped. He had every reason to humiliate her now. Instead, he protected her dignity the same way he had protected his own. The silence that followed felt different from every silence before it. It was not awkward. It was not uncertain. It was the silence that comes when truth finally arrives and leaves no room for excuses. And as morning sunlight slowly filled the old service station, Claire Montgomery understood something she would never forget. The strongest person in the room had never been the one sitting in the executive office. It had been the man she failed to recognize standing quietly right in front of her. By late morning, a tow truck had recovered Claire's sedan and both of them had returned to Columbus. The drive back felt different from the drive into the storm. Conversation came easier now. There were still silences, but they no longer felt guarded. When Ethan finally dropped Claire off at Montgomery Freight headquarters, neither seemed quite sure how to end the conversation. Thank you, Claire said quietly. Ethan nodded. You are welcome. For more than the ride. He understood what she meant. Take care of yourself, Claire. Then he drove away. Claire stood in the parking lot watching the old pickup disappear into traffic. For a long moment, she remained motionless. The towering glass headquarters behind her suddenly felt different than it had 24 hours earlier. Larger somehow. Colder. As she entered the building, employees immediately sensed something had changed. The confident stride was still there. The sharp focus remained. Yet there was a heaviness in her expression that nobody could quite explain. Her assistant hurried toward her. Claire, thank goodness. Everyone has been looking for you. Schedule a company-wide meeting. The assistant blinked. Today. What is the topic? Claire looked toward the executive floor. Accountability. The message spread quickly throughout the building. By 2 o'clock, employees filled the main conference hall. Department managers stood near the walls. Administrative staff filled the middle rows. Warehouse supervisors sat beside accountants. Dispatchers beside executives. Hundreds of employees gathered beneath bright overhead lights, exchanging confused whispers. Nobody knew why the emergency meeting had been called. At precisely 2 o'clock, Claire stepped onto the stage. The room grew quiet immediately. She stood behind the podium for several seconds before speaking. Yesterday morning, I made a decision. Her voice carried clearly across the hall. I believe that decision reflected strong leadership. Employees exchanged glances. Claire continued. I was wrong. The room became even quieter. Several executives shifted uneasily in their seats. Few people had ever heard Claire Montgomery publicly admit a mistake. I terminated an employee without understanding the full truth. No one moved. No one interrupted. I acted quickly. I acted confidently. And I acted unfairly. Her assistant looked stunned. Managers stared at one another. The atmosphere inside the hall changed completely. Claire stepped away from the podium. Ethan Walker, would you please come up here? A murmur spread through the audience. Heads turned toward the back of the room where Ethan stood near an exit. He had only come because Claire personally requested it. He looked as uncomfortable as everyone else looked surprised. Slowly, he walked toward the stage. The room watched every step. When Ethan reached the front, Claire turned to face him. Then she did something nobody expected. I owe you an apology. Complete silence filled the hall. Not privately. Claire's voice remained steady. Publicly. Ethan looked genuinely caught off guard. Claire faced the employees again. Mr. Walker spent the night before work at a hospital caring for his daughter. He arrived late because he was being a father. Several people lowered their eyes. Others looked shocked. Claire continued. Instead of asking questions, I assumed the worst. Instead of listening, I judged. Instead of leading with wisdom, I led with pride. The silence deepened. It was the kind of silence that could not be forced. It came only when truth arrived, and everyone recognized it at the same time. Claire looked directly at Ethan. You showed more character in one difficult day than I demonstrated in that conference room. Ethan shook his head slightly. Claire, you do not have to. Yes, she said gently. I do. She turned back toward the audience. Effective immediately, Ethan Walker is reinstated with full compensation for lost wages. A ripple moved through the room. But Claire was not finished. In addition, he will be offered a new leadership position overseeing facilities operations across all company properties. This time the room erupted into applause. Ethan stood speechless. Yet what affected him most was not the promotion, not the salary, not the recognition. It was the sincerity in Claire's voice. Because for the first time since they met, she was not speaking from authority. She was speaking from humility. And as applause echoed through the conference hall, many employees would later remember that afternoon not because a promotion was announced, but because an entire room witnessed what true accountability looked like when someone finally found the courage to choose grace over pride. 6 months later, autumn arrived in Columbus with golden leaves drifting across sidewalks and cool air carrying the scent of wood smoke and fresh coffee. Life had settled into a rhythm that felt very different from the one Ethan Walker knew before that stormy night. His new position kept him busy, but it also allowed him more flexibility with Sophie. That mattered more than any title ever could. On a bright Saturday morning, Ethan stood beside a small soccer field at a community park, watching a group of children chase a ball beneath a sky so blue it seemed painted. Parents lined the sidelines in folding chairs. Some cheered loudly. Others sipped coffee while talking quietly. Ethan did both. Come on, Sophie, he called. Sophie waved from midfield before immediately returning her attention to the game. Her cheeks were pink from running. Her laughter carried across the field. Healthy, happy, strong. Ethan smiled. There had been a time when he worried constantly about her health. Now, watching her sprint across the grass, he felt something he had not felt in years. Peace. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. She is getting faster. Ethan turned. Claire Montgomery stood beside him holding 2 cups of coffee. Gone was the sharp executive image that once seemed impossible to separate from her. Today she wore jeans, a light sweater, and comfortable sneakers. She looked less like a corporate leader and more like someone finally learning how to slow down. You made it, Ethan said. Claire handed him a cup. I promise, Sophie. As if hearing her name, Sophie glanced toward the sideline. The moment she spotted Claire, her face lit up. She waved enthusiastically before returning to the game. Claire laughed softly. I think she was checking to make sure I came. You have become her favorite person. I thought that was supposed to be your job. Ethan smiled. Apparently I have competition. The months following the company meeting had changed more than either of them expected. What began as occasional conversations became friendship. Friendship became trust. Trust became something deeper. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Quietly. The same way respect had first appeared between them. Claire started joining them for dinners. Then weekend outings. Then school events. Somewhere along the way, Sophie stopped asking if Claire was coming. She simply assumed she would be there. The soccer game ended shortly before noon. Children scattered across the field while parents gathered chairs and blankets. Sophie ran toward them carrying her water bottle. Did you see my goal? We sure did, Ethan said. It was amazing, Claire added. Sophie beamed proudly. Then she reached out and grabbed one hand from each of them. The gesture was so natural that neither adult reacted immediately. The 3 of them walked together toward a nearby food truck festival taking place across the park. Families filled the pathways. Music drifted through the air. Leaves swirled around their feet. At one point, Sophie looked up at Claire. Are you coming to the school concert next month? Claire smiled. Would not miss it. Promise. Promise. Sophie nodded with complete confidence. The kind only children possess when they know they are loved. Later that afternoon, after Sophie became distracted by a booth selling handmade crafts, Claire and Ethan found themselves standing quietly beneath a maple tree glowing with autumn colors. Neither spoke for a moment. They simply watched Sophie laughing nearby. Finally, Claire broke the silence. "You know, if my car had not broken down that night," Ethan smiled, "you would have made your conference." Claire laughed. "Probably." Then she looked toward Sophie. "And I would have missed all of this." Ethan followed her gaze. For a moment, neither seemed interested in saying more. They did not need to. Some truths no longer required words. The afternoon sun filtered through the branches above them. Children laughed in the distance. Somewhere nearby, a musician played an old acoustic guitar. Life felt simple, honest, whole. Ethan thought back to the conference room, where everything had seemed lost. Claire thought back to the highway, where everything had seemed broken. Neither could have imagined where those moments would eventually lead. Yet sometimes the greatest changes begin with small acts of kindness. Sometimes character reveals itself when nobody is watching. And sometimes the person we almost dismiss becomes the very person who reminds us what dignity, grace, and second chances truly look like. As Sophie ran back toward them carrying a handmade paper leaf and a smile wide enough to brighten the entire park, Ethan and Claire exchanged a glance filled with quiet understanding. Then together they walked forward to meet her, leaving the past behind and stepping into a future neither of them had expected, but both had come to treasure.